This is the behavioral health track. The session is titled Trickster Spirits and the Opioid Response, Cultural Considerations in Addressing Substance Misuse. Our presenter is Dr. Danica Love Brown. A little bit about Dr. Brown. She is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, born and raised in northern New Mexico. She is the Behavioral Health Program Director at the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board and has worked as a mental health and substance abuse counselor, social worker, and youth advocate for over 25 years. She has a history of working in the areas of prevention, drug and alcohol, mental health treatment, community and restorative justice, and sexual health with Native American and youth. She specializes in working with culturally and socioeconomically diverse populations and tribal communities. Dr. Brown is an Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, iSmart Fellow Alumni, Council of Social Work Education, Minority Fellowship Program Fellow Alumni, and Northwest Native American Research Center for Health Fellow Alumni. Her research is focused on Indigenous ways of knowing and decolonizing methodologies to address historical trauma and health disparities in tribal communities, and she loves puppies. With that being said, I would like to welcome Dr. Danica Love Brown.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Halito Achishiok Shalubo Hilini Fijik. My name's Danica. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and a descendant of the Ross clan from Scotland. And I'm the Behavioral Health Programs Director at the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board. And the Indian Health Board, we serve the 43 federally recognized tribes in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And a number of our tribes have asked us to work on incorporating traditional Indigenous knowledge in the work that we do. And so today's presentation is really kind of a culmination and discussion about how we've been able to do that. And we've done it in a number of the projects that we're doing at the board, but primarily we really worked to focus on indigenizing and decolonizing our understanding of substance misuse, particularly the opioid response. And so I wanted to just kind of share some of that information and knowledge that we've been collecting and gathering and consequently implementing in our tribal communities. And we've seen a significant increase in our tribes kind of shifting the way that they're looking at and working with tribal people, specifically with addressing the tribal opioid response work. And so today's presentation, we are going to be talking about trauma. We're going to be talking about historical trauma and what that means. And we are going to be sharing information that can be potentially could have a trauma response to. And so we want to just offer up the space and time to take care of yourself. Come back if you can. I will be available after this presentation if anyone wants to talk or process. But I just want to give a little bit of a content warning. We will be talking about, historical legacies of colonization that have impacted tribal people that can sometimes have a trauma response too. And so for this presentation is an attempt to help us to understand why tribal people respond and react to service providers in the way that they do. Unfortunately, we have an hour to talk about these things, and it's just not a lot of time to really dig in to all of the nuances. But like I said, I'll be available after this presentation or via my email to talk further or to provide any kind of support. For tribal people on what we know as Turtle Island, current and past political and social events help shape the context of our lives in ways that many other Americans don't experience. The work that we do at the board of historical trauma, intergenerational trauma of past and present is connected to historical genocidal assimilation and oppression, and despite treatment to such symptoms as depression, suicidal thoughts, anger, anxiety, low self-esteem, and difficulty in both recognizing and expressing emotions and impact substance misuse. A culturally responsive mental health system must recognize the broader social and political factors that underlie many mental health issues for Black and Indigenous people and other communities of color. For example, data show that therapy cannot be successful unless it recognizes the range of socio-political issues that contribute to clients' distress, instead of only identifying the individual issues that result from attempts to adjust to the socio-political conditions that they're living in. Even the American Psychological Association guidelines recognize the importance of socio-political factors in a client's treatment, such as generational history, the history of migration, citizen status, English fluency, the extent of support from family and community, and the level of stress resulting from acculturation. A successful mental health system must find ways to integrate mainstream services with culturally traditional services to address mental health needs of BIPOC people within the broader context of their lives. Substance misuse can impact anyone because it's a chronic health condition and not a moral failing. As a community, we can look towards the story of the trickster or the tricky one to learn how substance use can impact tribal communities, similarly in sneaky and cunning ways. In oral tradition, Trickster is a sacred being that assumes many forms. He can be old man coyote to some tribes, raven to the Northwest tribes, or more generically, the tricky one among other tribes. And that's just to mention a few of the manifestations. But the trickster scandalizes, it disgusts, it amuses, it disrupts, it chastises, and humiliates or is humiliated by the animal-like proto-people of prehistory. Yet he is a creative force transforming the world, sometimes in bizarre and outrageous ways. With his instinctive energies and cunning, eternally scavenging for food, he represents the most basic instincts. But in other narratives, he is also the father of Native people and a strong conductor of spiritual forces in the form of sacred dreams, visions, and prayers. In respect to substance use disorders, the substances we use are the first medicines meant to cure and heal. And at some point, this transforms into misuse of the medicine, then moves into dependency. So we can imagine that trickster spirit coming in and taking a medicine that was originally used for good and twist that into a use disorder. And we can imagine when people who are misusing or dependent on substances, it's that same kind of coyote energy where they're scavenging, they're hoarding, they're stealing, they're creating environments that are really challenging. And so instead of looking at it as a moral disorder, we can look at it as a trickster spirit that's come in and shifted that relationship that we have with medicine. So we can imagine that there's a trickster spirit that is the culprit in this. The spirit is attempting to teach us important lessons of humanity, compassion, of living in balance with the natural world, respect for the spirit in the medicines we use. And I want to be specific in this presentation. The use of the word medicine is not within the Western context of a prescription, but rather the energy that traditional medicines carry. So for us, medicine can be water, or is water, is the food that we eat, it is the jewelry that we wear. Medicine is the relationships that we have with each other. And so when we're talking in this presentation about medicines, that's what we're talking about. And so there's multiple aspects to consider when looking at opioid misuse and substance dependency in particularly. First, the essence of opioids and other medications is a powerful spirit or prescription to be used. Primarily, opioids are prescribed to ease suffering and pain. Second, the current perception of substance use disorders stigmatizes and produces shame or guilt. And so when we look to the trickster spirit and utilize this, it shifts the way that we understand substance use, and consequently, it shifts the stigmatization of substance misuse. And in order to help and heal and learn the lessons that tricksters offer, we need to address our relationships to medicines rather than the substance use process by shifting our understanding and relationship with medicine. And current research has shown that there's a significant connection with trauma and substance misuse, and primarily how trauma creates disassociation with other human beings and connection. And so trauma is an extraordinary psychological event experienced caused by threats to life and body, or personal encounters with violence or death. And there's two ways that generally happens: through natural disasters or through atrocities. And disasters are natural forming events that happen in the world, and atrocities are human caused. And a lot of times these two things can come together. For example, in this pandemic, the pandemic itself is a natural disaster. There was a virus that was exposed, humans were exposed to. It's created an international human condition that has impacted us. But the way that different governments have responded to that have either alleviated the trauma response to that or created trauma response to it. It's important to acknowledge, though, that the term trauma comes from a Western medical context. And so when we really want to think about these terms within a Western context, it's very kind of focused on deficits. It's focused on a disease or something that's wrong with something that needs to be cured or fixed. And within Indigenous cultures, we understand that the trauma response has really been a way for us to survive. And so alternative terms centered in an Indigenous worldview for us to consider would be, for example, parallel realities or multiple realities, which recognize the value and legitimacy of these experiences, which often reveal important context that is vital to one's healing process. So developing an Indigenous or decolonial understanding of trauma helps eliminate, again, the stigma that is tied to Western understanding and helps us to create space for growth and healing of the people that we serve. And so, we know that trauma happens in our bodies. It's a trauma response is designed to help us survive. And that's a really beautiful thing. And we want to shift that understanding of trauma from a deficit perspective to a strengths perspective. And so there are, 4 primary ways that we address our bodies deal with trauma. There's the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And flight can be seen as anger, anxiety, or adrenaline rushes. Flight can be seen as overexcitement. It can also be processed as anger, where we focus on anything but the specific trauma. Freeze can be seen as depression, sadness, and ambivalence. And a lot of times when we're in the freeze response, our executive functioning is impacted. So we're not, taking care of ourselves. We see people who have hygiene issues or their space is really chaotic. And then fawning, in a nutshell, fawning is the use of people pleasing to diffuse conflict, to feel more secure in relationships, and to earn the approval of others. like, for now, when we think about living in this historical traumatic event of the pandemic, we continually are gathering new information all the time. And our limbic system decides whether we are in danger and then cycles through the fight, flight, freeze options. And as providers, we're both expected to gather, interpret this data for our communities. And so we, as caregivers in the pandemic, we're experiencing kind of a double load of trauma, and our bodies are just responding to that. That's why we're exhausted all the time. But trauma and fear create detachment, and the antidote is attachment and connection. And now we're living in a different world where many times everything we're doing is virtual. So in the pandemic, we're asked to socially distance, and then that impacts our ability to stabilize in crisis. And so there's this kind of vicious cycle that happens. And I want to talk a little bit about historical trauma versus like other forms of trauma, but I want to share a little short video that kind of highlights historical trauma.
Historical trauma is defined as a collective and cumulative wounding across generations that results from massive catastrophic events targeting a community. So historically traumatic events would be forced removal, relocation, boarding schools, slavery. There's almost uncountable massacres in the United States against Indian people, and that doesn't even begin to count what happened across the border, across the many borders. There's a whole body of science now that's beginning to show that the experiences of our environments actually become embodied. They can impact the genetic material surrounding our DNA. So the trauma is held personally as well as collectively, and it can be passed on through the generations.
I remember the day that I was taken to Greyhound in Crown Point, New Mexico. I was 12 years old. Whole line of buses were in line when we went to the trading post, and that's where they put us in a bus and didn't tell us where we were going. I was crying, my mother was crying, my dad was angry, and I know that my mom had the roughest time with that. A lot of people that were there bringing their children were upset, and I was scared, confused. All of us were, and they took us. To this day, I remember my mom standing there crying. And we end up in a place called Inner Mountain, and that was in Utah. We were told that the way you live and the way you believe is not acceptable by us. We need to cut your hair. You cannot speak Navajo anymore. You're going to learn how to speak English. I had long hair, and it got cut. The sadness that I felt, it was painful. I couldn't sleep. I was scared that something would happen while I'm asleep. I felt like I lost everything in terms of my family, my relatives, and I was in the middle of this place where even if I was to run away, I didn't know which way to go. I remember some people hanging themselves in the dormitory and things like that. Some kids ran away and didn't make it home. A lot of people got sick. I remember a few times that I was in trouble only because I opened my mouth to say something in Navajo. But that did not affect me physically, but affected me emotionally because I began to think like, what's wrong with me? There must be something wrong with me. But no matter what they said to me, I knew who I was. The teaching from my dad was very strong to the point where I think that kept me going all these years. At some point, you have to make up your mind, are you going to be in pain the rest of your life? And you got to search around, how do I get rid of it? There's ways to do that. And a lot has to do with the spirituality. You'll never forget what happened, but you'll be in charge of that healing.
We actually have our own mechanisms to interrupt that intergenerational transmission of trauma in a way that gets at the source of the wound. Narrative is one of the ways that we interrupt that direct line of the trauma to the outcome. And story for Indigenous people is in our way of being. So we dance, we pray, and we speak, and we tell our stories. And we create things new. We define what being Indigenous is now. Who we are is completely up to us.
So that video, one of the reasons I like to share that video is not only does Dr. Ramona Beltran, talk about kind of what historical trauma is, she also talks about how we can heal historical and intergenerational trauma through culture and through our story and through our narrative. And what we're now understanding, the way that we can access that and access that healing is through moving back to and accessing our culture and our cultural activities. What she also talks about in that video, is about the epigenetic transfer of trauma. And there is some evidence that of an epigenetic transfer of that trauma which can be passed down from generation to generation. But what we don't understand as much, but Indigenous people understand, is that the memory of our ancestors are passed down on our blood. So not only is the historical trauma passed down, but our ancestral wisdom and knowledge and resiliencies are also passed down. And the way that we access that ancestral wisdom and knowledge is through ritual, is through ceremony, it's through accessing our culture. And this is a picture of my grandfather. His name was Watches Standing Buffalo, and he used to say to me, all the time that the memories of our ancestors were passed down on our blood. And so, what he was telling me back when I was a child, what we're just starting to understand now. And that what's really important is to access our ancestral strength and resiliency so that we can continue to thrive under, pretty adverse conditions right now. And so there's also some models for understanding this. Dr. Karina Walters, Jane Simoni, and Tessa Evans Campbell have come up with an Indigenous stress coping paradigm, which really helps us to understand the connection between trauma and health outcomes, but also how cultural buffers, particularly our connection to our identity, enculturation, spiritual coping, and traditional health practices contribute to or can buffer or mediate the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma. And so what we want to do is access those cultural buffers to increase healing. And so part of what we understand is that trauma is stored in the limbic system of the brain, which is not connected to language, and memory is stored in the cerebral cortex with language. So what we need to do when we're talking about the healing of trauma is to bring the limbic system back into health and communicating with the cerebral cortex. What we also understand in Western science is to do that, one of the best ways to do that is through mindfulness activities, through breathing and breath work. And when understanding that from an indigenous perspective is that we utilize ritual, ceremony, prayer, meditation, dancing, and all of those things. So when we're doing those things, what we're doing is bringing our parasympathetic nervous system back into balance, bringing oxygen to the brain so that the different parts of our brain are communicating better and accessing knowledge and health and balance. And so when we think about substance use, substance dependence always originates in pain. The very same brain centers that interpret and feel physical pain become activated during the experience of emotional pain, particularly rejection. On brain scans, they light up in response to social ostracism, just as they would when triggered by a physical stimuli. So at the center of substance misuse is hurt, it's pain. And so when we think about any kind of addictive behavior, what we're trying to do is to alleviate that pain, whether it be physical pain or emotional pain or spiritual pain. And so when we also look at that, we understand that people who are dependent on substances, especially chronic long-term, dependency, what we really understand is that these are human beings who are suffering. And our job as providers is to ease that suffering and ease that pain. Again, shifting our understanding of what substance misuse is and what it's not. But in fact, we want to understand that there's hope. We know that trauma reactions may occur when there's substantial or perceived or actual threats. However, we also know that people experience the same event and react differently to those events. And there may be traumatized, one thing might traumatize someone and the same event wouldn't traumatize others. And so what we really want to understand is how we deal with and address that trauma response, specifically around substance misuse, and understanding that substance misuse is a trauma response to ease the suffering and pain that people are experiencing. So when we think about a resilience response to substance or to trauma, many people find healthy ways to cope with and respond to. And often people automatically reevaluate their values and redefine what is important after a trauma. And such resilient responses can include increased bonding with family and community, redefined increased sense of self, increased commitment to a personal mission, revised priorities, and increased charitable giving and volunteerism. And so a lot of it is when we want to address specifically that disconnection that happens is to reconnect. And, so when we're talking about providing services and support to people who are having a trauma response, what we need to do is think about how we address those issues. So we want to support our clients and patients a message of hope. Hope is one of the most powerful medicines that we have. And so we want to reframe trauma as something that happened to them. It's not who they are. And so a lot of times what I say to people that I'm working with is that you're having a normal response to an extraordinary event, and that your response is normal. And let's work through that together. So we want to reframe the experiencing and the re-experiencing of those events. We want to communicate that treatment and other wellness activities can both improve psychological and physiological symptoms. You want to discuss traumatic stress symptoms and their psychological components. So explaining the links between the traumatic stress symptoms and substance use disorders, if appropriate. And you want to normalize trauma symptoms. For example, explaining to clients that their symptoms are not a sign of weakness or a character flaw, or that they're being damaged, or that they're going quote unquote crazy. And so, what we know works are those people who are fluent in many theories and models of treatment, clients, providers who are client-centered and counselor-driven. We want to focus on strength and protective factors, and we want to be able to develop trusting therapeutic relationships with the people that we serve. And we still want to work in our areas of expertise. So if you don't feel comfortable talking about trauma, then we need to refer someone to a trauma specialist. And what we really want to do is focus on culture and look at culture as prevention and connecting people to, culturally responsive, culturally humiliative programs and work.
Excuse me, Dr. Brown, we can't see your screen.
Oh, really? Okay, I
think you just have to reshare from after the video. So just, yeah.
I picked the wrong there. Sorry about that, everybody. Is it there now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. So for tribal communities, what we really want to focus on is wellness and wholeness. Within Western context, we usually focus on the disease and kind of compartmentalizing disease and symptoms. Within Indigenous perspectives, we want to focus on wellness. And health and wellness from a traditional Indigenous perspective is centered in a holistic understanding and model. This includes philosophies that equally consider the spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical aspects of a person. The mind-body split has influenced so much of psychiatric thinking, and we need to kind of move away from that. We want to understand that health and wellness is an indication that wellness involves multiple facets of the life, including the environment, the space that we live in, the health and wellness of our Mother Earth, and the health and wellness of other human beings that we are in. And so we want to develop a conceptual framework for treating health among American Indian groups, including the dimensions of caring, tradition, connection, holism, trust, and spirituality. One definition of wellness is an aesthetic dimension to knowledge transmission, and it may enhance identity and visibility of also past traditions. Many American Indian traditions look to the medicine wheel to define wellness, seeking balance in the physical and mental, emotional, and spiritual interactions of life. Indigenous philosophies are holistic in nature, which consider equally these four areas of the human condition in relationship to Mother Earth, which is our land and resources, and Father Sky, which is our natural law and ancestral wisdom. This is a contrast to Western philosophies, which compartmentalize these aspects and rarely address or consider the spiritual aspect of the human condition. Indigenous models are based in wellness, while Western models are concerned about disease. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders defines mental health as a state marked by the absence of illness, where Indigenous philosophies understand mental health as a broad spectrum of challenges that tribal people face in their life walk. American Indian elders and developers at the board, we've been working with tribal elders from Alaska to develop a holistic understanding of this work, specifically to address opioid use disorder. And we've developed a model called the 49 Days of Ceremony. And we worked with two tribal elders from Alaska, Doug and Amy Modag. And Doug grew up in Portland, Oregon, and he went to Chemawa Indian School. And then when he got out of Chemawa Indian School, he ended up going to prison. When he got out of prison, he connected with some folks in Portland, and they essentially started the Native American Rehabilitation Association. At that time, they were just going around downtown Portland, Oregon, and picking up, drunk Native people off the streets and taking them home and giving them food and praying for them and doing stuff. And then they ended up buying a house, and now we have an organization that's been serving tribal people in Portland, Oregon for almost 40 years. And so when we taught, they developed this understanding, but there's 7 aspects to it. There's the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. There's Mother Earth, which is again about our resources and access to all living beings in our space. And then Father Sky, which is our relationship to our ancestors, to our ancestral knowledge and wisdom, which usually comes through our relationship to our tribes and our culture. The final aspect of this is the sacred fire within, which is that internal fire, that flame that motivates us to change and to work through some of our historical and intergenerational trauma. And so we're developing an intervention that focuses on igniting that sacred fire within. But wellness is related to our understanding of balance, to ourself, our family, and our community. Renee Linklater identifies several themes in understanding American Indian wellness, including balance and harmony, being in creation. We're not separate from creation or creator, we are part of it, and care and compassion, and the challenges that American Indian and Alaska Native communities contend with in pursuit to wellness. Specifically, she states that the core of the human experience is spiritual, and the core of human wellness is spirit and spiritual. And so when we think about all of these things, we think about how do we access our culture, how do we access Father Sky, and we do that through connecting to our culture. All of our traditional understandings of the world are passed down through kind of oral traditions and through songs and dance and ceremony. But we can do that is access our creation stories, which share with us how we interact in the world. And when we're talking about specifically our relationship with substance use disorders, what we want to do is shift our understanding and our relationship to medicine. And so a lot of the work we do at the board is really understanding and shifting our relationship with medicine, our relationship with the actual medicine, whether it's a medicine that's from our garden or if it's a prescribed medication. So we want to reestablish our relationship with that spirit in the medicine. And then we want to change our relationship with our medicine people, whether it's elders and medicine knowledge keepers in our communities, developing relationships with those people in our communities, or it's the way that we develop our relationship with our care providers, our doctors, our medicine people in hospitals, or our primary care physicians. We need to change our relationship with each other. That also means that care providers need to change the way that they interact with people, primarily Black and Indigenous people and other people of color. And so it's a two-way street. And then finally, to develop a relationship with the spirit of substances and substance misuse. Dr. Eduardo Duran wrote a really beautiful book called Healing the Soul Wound. And he talks about any condition that we have, whether it be substance use, suicidology, diabetes, heart disease, any of that. And all of these diseases, he talks about have a spirit. And that if we want to heal and transform that, we need to develop a relationship with that spirit. And so part of what I'm talking about here is developing a relationship with the spirit, not only of the medicine, but also develop a relationship with the spirit of the disease. And so, you know, we understand that we can heal our communities through culture, connection, developing intervention and policies that are grounded in traditional Indigenous knowledge, tribal best practices, and evidence-based practice. This is not just true in the case of substance use disorders, but in other health conditions as well. And so with that, I want to just offer up time and space for some conversation or questions.
If you have any questions, you can just either raise your hand or you can just unmute yourselves. You can also put questions in the chat box as well, if that's easier.
So while people are pondering their question and discussion, I'll give some specific examples of the work that we've done at the board. So we are creating the 49 Days of Ceremony, which is a community-based activity that has the 49 Days of Ceremony as a model conceptual framework that goes over that. And like I shared in the presentation, there are the 7 aspects. But there are also 3 practices. There's the planning phase of the intervention. And so what communities do is pick a cultural activity that they want to implement into their community. And so we did pilot this project in a community in Alaska where they did a canoe journey. And so part of the intervention was that they gathered their tribal people, their knowledge keepers, and they found a person who can build a canoe in a traditional way. And they are in the process right now of building a canoe. And at a certain point, they'll do a canoe journey in honoring and memorial of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So the planning phase, which usually starts in a visioning or prayer to address a specific issue in their community, and then you pull people together and do a community asset mapping process with your community. Then you implement the activity, and there's like kind of a process of overlapping the lessons for the 49 Days of Ceremony in those 7 aspects. And then the last part of it is a prayer and reflection phase. And essentially that's an evaluation of the project, what went well, what didn't go well, what lessons were integrated with participants. And so it's usually a year-long process from planning to implementation and prayer and reflection. And so that's one of the projects that we're doing at the board. One of the other projects that we are currently working on is we have been working with tribal communities around integrating traditional Indigenous knowledge into their MAT programs. And so part of it, and at some point I'll put a link to, or I'll send out, we created a Trickster story specifically to the tribal opioid response. And so we've been working with tribal communities to essentially talk about this reframing of substance use treatment, specifically around implementing MAT. And the particular project that we kind of highlight and talk about is a project that was started, I think about 6 years ago now in Swinomish community up in northern Washington. And the project is called Digwa-Leach, and I'll put also a link to the project there. But Digwa-Leach is an MAT integrated treatment program that also incorporates traditional and Indigenous knowledge into the space. And it's also a trauma-informed practice. So everyone from the CEO all the way down to the bus driver that picks people up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get their MAT is trained in trauma-informed care and also in traditional Indigenous knowledge. And so it's been a hugely successful program for that community. They serve anyone, not just Swinomish people, but they serve anyone, but especially tribal people in that community. And they have expanded their services to not just include primary care services. They now provide dental care and services to people who are accessing treatment. And then they have also, based on a survey of people who did not succeed in the program, They interviewed people and said, what could we have done better? And what they found was there was 2 obstacles. One was transportation and housing. So they started a bus program where they go around at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and pick people up and take them to treatment and drop them off. And then the other issue was housing and affordable and accessible housing. So they've started to develop a housing program where they have a transitional housing program that should be up and running in the next couple of months. So there are a number of things that they do, and they provide traditional medicine people there to access, and they provide alternative and treatment modalities. The other thing that we've been doing is we started elders and knowledge keepers gathering, because what we found is a lot of people do not know how they don't have a lot of traditional people or knowledge keepers in their community to access this care. So we started a knowledge keepers and elders and knowledge keepers gathering where we bring those folks together. And we share essentially knowledge around different topics. And we've been doing those gatherings. We're going to have our 3rd gathering in September. But based out of that, what we found is that knowledge keepers and elders feel very isolated and alone, and don't feel supported by their communities in many ways. And so we are going to start get an elders and knowledge keepers ECHO, which is a telehealth medicine platform, but we will have a panel of elders and knowledge keepers, and behavioral health specialists and tribal communities can present a case to those tribal and knowledge keepers to get feedback about traditional indigenous medicine. But then there'll also be a community of practice where those elders and knowledge keepers can be supported and support each other. So there's kind of that ECHO will provide 2 different aspects of that. So those are some of the ways that we have integrated traditional indigenous knowledge into the work that we do at the board.
Dr. Brown, I would like to say thank you for the presentation first. I do have a question in terms of just in today's time. I think a lot of the tribal nations that I personally am working with at USET have been seeing a lot of, I think everyone kind of experienced the lockdown from the first round of the pandemic, and then things were opening back up, and then now they're closing down again. Do you have or have seen any creative ways that communities have been able to implement prevention programs or any wellness activities for those dealing with behavioral health crises or issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So at a few months into the pandemic, we had received CDC supplemental agreement funding to address essentially behavioral health issues as a result of COVID. So one of the first things that we did was we hosted some talking circles with tribal leaders, both kind of informal leaders and then public health tribal leaders. And we also conducted a survey with providers, and we asked them questions about what they're seeing, what they're doing, how they're adapting. And out of that survey, we found that a lot of tribes were really becoming creative in the way that they were addressing certain issues in their communities. So, what one tribe was doing was that they were having virtual town halls. And part of it was inviting kind of keynote speakers to come and talk about specific issues related to COVID. But then they also would send out different kits to the tribal citizens where, 1 week it would be a medicine bag making kit. The other week it would be a medicine wheel making kit or a dream catcher making kit. And then they would do these activities and crafts together. And so that was one way that they were, and I did a keynote at one of those, and there was well over 100 people who participated in that town hall, which was really impressive. This was a small tribe in Southern Oregon. So that was one way that we saw people utilizing and adapting. I think a lot of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest, because Washington was really, really hit hard with COVID, and we were seeing a lot of deaths because of COVID, specifically in like Yakima Nation. And so Yakima Nation really like stepped up and started like integrating protocols around, you know, gatherings and stuff. And we saw a lot of grief associated with that, not just the grief of the loss of people, but the fact that they were not able to like have their traditional ceremonies and bereavement practices. So we were working with the Yakima Nation not only to set up protocols for COVID, but we were also engaging other tribal elders to kind of reestablish grieving and bereavement protocols. And so they were really utilizing, again, you know, utilizing virtual platforms to kind of create a space for people to grieve and to practice their bereavement practices. And so, you know, we were seeing a lot of that kind of stuff happening. We established a behavioral health echo specifically as a result of that, where we wanted to be able to create a space for communities to talk about some of the things that they were doing. And so a lot of communities were just utilizing virtual platforms, but also, you know, creating outdoor spaces where they could still hold their groups and hold their, you know, treatment outside. So there was, I think the Cowlitz, I don't remember exactly if that was them or not, but one of the smaller Washington tribes built like these huge pergolas where they could have groups outside, and there was like, they were semi-enclosed, so there was some privacy. These weren't treatment groups, they were prevention groups and like wellness groups and cultural activity groups. And even in the canoe journey that we did up in Washington, when we were building the canoe, it was in the Heritage Center, which has a huge garage that's, you know, like 20 feet high, and it was just massive. And so, and we had, you could only have 6 people in the space at any given time. So we would fluctuate and bring in and out people. So, and they're putting off the actual journey until everyone can come back together to participate safely in that journey. But so there's been creative ways that has been addressed in our communities.
Great, thank you for that. And I want to thank everyone for attending the session. I do want to share